The rain lashed against the windshield as Emma parked her car in front of the old clinic. It was a squat, pale building with peeling paint and boarded-up windows, tucked away on the outskirts of town. The surrounding trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows across the cracked asphalt lot. She shivered, though it wasn't entirely from the cold. This was her first shift, and something about the place felt off. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and age. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, giving the hallway a sickly green hue. Emma clutched her bag tightly and walked toward the reception desk, where a young man, about her age, sat slumped over the counter. His name tag read Kyle. "You must be the new girl," Kyle said without looking up. His voice was flat, his fingers drumming nervously against the desk. "You sure you want to work here?" Emma offered a polite smile, trying to mask her unease. "It's just a night shift. I'll be fine." Kyle finally looked at her, his eyes shadowed and tired. "This place, it's not like other clinics. Weird stuff happens here." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Have you heard the story about Dr. Bellamy?" "No," Emma replied, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "What happened?" Kyle glanced around nervously before speaking. "Dr. Bellamy used to run this clinic. Brilliant guy, they said. But one day, he and a handful of patients just vanished. No one knows what happened to them. The clinic shut down not long after. But every now and then, people say they hear things. Voices, footsteps, stuff that shouldn't be there." Emma forced a laugh, hoping to shake off the growing tension. "Sounds like a story to scare the new hires." Kyle didn't laugh. "Maybe, but if you hear anything tonight, don't go looking for it." With that ominous warning, he handed her a key and pointed down the hall. "Your office is at the end. The archives are in the basement." The hallway seemed to stretch forever, each step echoing ominously. Emma's new office was small and sparse, with a metal desk, a creaky chair, and a single lamp that cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. She set her bag down and took a deep breath. The first few hours passed uneventfully as she sorted through dusty files. Most were medical records from decades ago, filled with scrawled notes and faded x-rays. She was beginning to settle into a rhythm when she heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like someone gently rapping their knuckles against a door. Emma froze, her pulse quickening. The sound was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She told herself it was just the old building settling, nothing to worry about. But as the minutes ticked by, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the basement. She hesitated, Kyle's warning ringing in her ears, but curiosity got the better of her. Grabbing her flashlight, she made her way to the basement door. It creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into complete darkness. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up, making her stomach turn. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. No response. The tapping continued, now echoing up the staircase. It had a strange rhythm, almost like Morse code. Emma tightened her grip on the flashlight and started down the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing rows of dusty shelves filled with old medical equipment and file boxes. At the far end of the basement, she spotted a heavy metal door she hadn't noticed before. The tapping was coming from behind it. Her heart pounded as she approached, her breath visible in the frigid air. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a small windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with jars, each one filled with murky liquid and something floating inside. Organs? Specimens? She couldn't tell. In the center of the room stood a gurney, its surface stained dark with something she didn't want to identify. The tapping had stopped. The silence was deafening. As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her. Emma yelped, spinning around and tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, shouting for help. The light flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement in the shadows. Something was in the room with her. The light flickered again, revealing the faint outline of a figure in the corner. Emma's breath hitched as she backed away, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, oppressive. It was as though the air itself was pressing down on her chest. A sudden knock came at the door, loud and frantic, making Emma jump. Then a voice, Kyle's voice. "Emma, are you in there?" "Yes," she screamed, racing to the door. But as soon as she touched the handle, the voice changed. It deepened, distorted, turning into something unrecognizable. Emma. Her stomach dropped as she realized Kyle couldn't be at the door. He'd left hours ago. The figure in the corner moved, jerking unnaturally like a marionette with tangled strings. Its head tilted, and though its face was shrouded in darkness, she felt its gaze bore into her. The jars around the room began to rattle, their contents thrashing violently. A deafening crash filled the room as the light bulb above exploded, plunging her into total darkness. Emma screamed, scrambling blindly for the door. She pounded on it, desperate to escape. Behind her, the sound of wet, squelching footsteps grew louder, closing the distance. Just as she felt the icy grip of a hand on her shoulder, the door burst open, flooding the room with blinding light. She stumbled out, collapsing into the hallway. A figure loomed over her, but it wasn't the creature. It was Kyle. He pulled her to her feet, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "We have to go. Now." Emma didn't argue. They ran up the stairs and out into the stormy night. As they reached her car, Emma turned to Kyle, trembling. "What the hell was that?" Kyle shook his head, his expression grim. "I told you not to go looking. Some doors should never be opened." As they drove away, Emma glanced back at the clinic. In one of the darkened windows, she saw a shadow move, and the faint sound of tapping echoed in her ears. But the nightmare didn't end there. The next morning, Emma woke up in her apartment, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But her hands still trembled, and the unease clung to her like a second skin. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Kyle. "Stay away from mirrors tonight." Heart pounding, Emma stared at her reflection in the hallway mirror. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and her reflection's eyes began to move, even though she hadn't. The tapping started again, louder now, coming from every wall in the apartment. She realized with a sinking dread, she wasn't alone anymore. The clinic, it had followed her home, and this time, it wouldn't let her escape. The legend of Ashford Hospital was whispered in hushed tones in our small town. It had been abandoned for nearly 30 years, standing as a decaying monument to its grim history. Rumors swirled about the dark experiments conducted within its walls, and those who dared to explore its crumbling corridors often returned with wild stories if they returned at all. Still, the allure of uncovering its secrets was irresistible to me and my closest friends. Mike, Sarah, Emma, and Jason. We were thrill seekers, always on the hunt for the next adrenaline rush. Little did we know, this adventure would be unlike anything we had ever faced. The night was eerily quiet as we approached the hospital. The building loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette cutting against the pale moonlight. Vines snaked up its walls, and shattered windows stared down at us like hollow eyes. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy that made my skin prickle. "You sure about this, Jake?" Sarah asked, her voice wavering slightly as she adjusted the strap of her backpack. "It's just an old building," I replied, forcing a grin to mask my own unease. "Besides, it'll make a great story to tell." Mike laughed, his bravado unwavering. "Yeah, if we don't chicken out first." Jason smirked, but Emma's wide eyes betrayed her apprehension. "Let's just get this over with," she muttered. We stepped through the rusted gate, the creak echoing ominously in the stillness. The front doors were chained shut, but Mike had come prepared with bolt cutters. The metallic snap of the chain falling to the ground felt deafening, like a gunshot in the night. Inside, the hospital was a labyrinth of shadow and decay. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed down the hallways. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and graffiti scrawled on the walls. The words, "Leave now," were painted in jagged red letters near the entrance. "Probably just some kids messing around," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. We ventured deeper, our footsteps crunching on debris-strewn floors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional scurry of rodents. We decided to split up to cover more ground, a decision I immediately regretted. Mike and Sarah headed toward the east wing, while Jason, Emma, and I took the west. As we wandered the dim corridors, an unsettling feeling crept over me. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the darkness growing thicker with each step. Emma clung to my arm, her grip tightening whenever a floorboard creaked or a shadow shifted. Jason tried to keep the mood light, cracking jokes that fell flat in the oppressive atmosphere. "What's that?" Emma whispered, pointing her flashlight toward an open door. We stepped inside what appeared to be an old operating room. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered on a blood-stained table, and the walls were lined with cracked tiles. A large mirror hung on one wall, its surface fogged and streaked. As we approached, I thought I saw movement in the glass, but when I looked closer, it was just our reflections. Or so I thought. The figure that emerged from the shadows was a grotesque mockery of a child, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its hollow black eyes seemed to swallow the light. Its mouth stretched into a wide, toothy grin, far too large for its face. The sight of it froze us in place, our breaths caught in our throats. The thing let out a low, gurgling laugh before vanishing into the shadows again. Emma let out a choked sob, her grip on my arm tightening painfully. "What the hell was that?" Jason hissed, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I whispered, my heart pounding, "but we need to get out of here. Now." We moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards and distant sounds setting our nerves on edge. The hospital seemed alive, shifting around us as though it wanted to keep us trapped. Hallways that had been straight now twisted into impossible angles, and doors that should have led to exits opened into pitch-black voids. "It's like the building's changing," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible. As we turned a corner, we came across a staircase leading down. The air wafting up from below was cold and smelled of damp earth. None of us wanted to descend, but the sound of heavy footsteps behind us left us no choice. We hurried down the stairs, the dim glow of our flashlights barely illuminating the way. At the bottom, the basement walls were lined with rusted pipes that dripped foul-smelling liquid, and the floor was slick with moisture. The oppressive darkness seemed to press in on us, and the faint sound of distant whispers grew louder with every step. "This is a bad idea," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "Do you think we have a choice?" Mike replied, his usual bravado gone. The whispers carried an undeniable malice that made my skin crawl. As we rounded a corner, our flashlights flickered and went out. Sarah's flashlight sputtered back to life, casting a weak beam that barely pierced the darkness. In the faint light, we saw a series of old metal doors lining the corridor. Most were rusted shut, but one hung ajar, revealing a room beyond. Inside, the room was cluttered with medical equipment, and yellowed papers scattered across a desk. An old journal lay open, its pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. Jason picked it up, his face pale as he read aloud. "The experiments have failed. The patients are beyond saving. They are changing, becoming something else. We must seal the lower levels." He paused, flipping through the pages. "May God forgive us for what we've done here." A loud clang echoed from behind us, and we all spun around. The metal door slammed shut, trapping us inside. Panic set in as we tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from the far corner of the room, a faint glow appeared. A figure emerged, its form translucent and flickering like static on an old television screen. "Leave," it whispered, its voice layered with echoes. "You don't belong here." "We're trying," I shouted, desperation in my voice. "Just let us go." The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unbearable cacophony. My vision blurred, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the whispers stopped, and the door creaked open on its own. "Go," the figure said, its voice softer now, almost pleading, "before it's too late." We bolted out of the room, the faint glow of the apparition fading behind us. The hospital seemed angrier now, its walls groaning and shifting as we ran. Shadows darted along the edges of our vision, and the sound of footsteps echoed around us, though we couldn't see their source. Finally, we found a staircase leading up. We scrambled to the ground floor, bursting through a set of double doors into the night. The cold air hit us like a wave, and we collapsed onto the overgrown lawn, gasping for breath. As we lay there, the hospital loomed behind us, its dark windows seeming to watch. A faint light flickered in one of the upper floors, and I thought I saw a figure standing there watching. Then it was gone. None of us spoke as we made our way back to the car. The ride home was silent, the weight of what we'd experienced pressing down on us. Back in the safety of my living room, we sat in silence until Emma finally whispered, "What was that place?" "I don't know," I replied, "but we're never going back." We vowed to move on, but the nightmares came anyway. Each of us dreamed of the hospital, its dark corridors, and the horrors within. Sometimes I'd wake up in a cold sweat, sure I could hear whispers outside my window. The legend of Ashford Hospital was real, and we had escaped. But something had followed us, lingering just beyond the light, waiting, and I feared it wasn't finished with us yet. The evening sun hung low, casting long, eerie shadows across the deserted streets of Ashbourne. The town, once bustling, had become a ghost of its former self. Tom and his daughter Lily often played hide and seek here, their laughter echoing against the weathered facades of abandoned shops and houses. It was their way of escaping the silence that had settled over the town like a suffocating blanket. "Count to 20, Daddy," Lily called, her blue eyes gleaming with excitement. Tom turned toward the lamppost, covered his eyes with his hands, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. Lily giggled and darted away, her small sneakers pattering against the cracked pavement. She was an expert at hiding, often leading her father on wild chases through alleyways and overgrown yards. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more pronounced, as if the town itself was holding its breath. 18, 19, 20. "Ready or not, here I come." Tom opened his eyes and looked around. Lily was nowhere in sight. He smiled, knowing her cleverness, and began his search. He checked the usual spots: behind the rusting car, inside the hollowed-out mailbox, and around the crumbling fountain. No Lily. As he wandered further down the street, he noticed a trail of tiny footprints in the dust, leading toward the hulking silhouette of St. Mercy's Hospital. The building had been abandoned for years after a fire gutted the upper floors. Its windows were shattered, and ivy crept along the cracked walls, as if nature were trying to reclaim it. Tom hesitated. Lily wouldn't go in there, he muttered to himself. But the footprints led straight to the hospital's entrance, where the heavy double doors hung ajar. He stepped inside, the air instantly cooler and filled with the scent of mildew and decay. "Lily?" His voice echoed down the dark corridor, coming back to him in distorted whispers. His chest tightened as he flicked on the flashlight app on his phone, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, lined with peeling wallpaper and doors hanging off their hinges. Somewhere in the distance, he heard a faint giggle. "Lily, this isn't funny," he called, his voice betraying his growing unease. He followed the sound, his footsteps echoing against the cracked tiles. The giggle came again, this time closer, but it sounded off. It was as if something were mimicking Lily's voice, twisting it just enough to make his skin crawl. Tom pushed open a door marked Pediatrics and stepped inside. Rows of tiny rusting beds lined the room, their once bright paint flaking away. A child's toy sat in the corner, its one remaining eye staring blankly at him. As he moved further into the room, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. He spun around, heart pounding, and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Lily, if you are here, answer me." His voice cracked, desperation creeping in. The giggle came again, this time from behind him. He whirled around, and his flashlight caught a glimpse of something darting into the shadows. The room grew colder, and a low, guttural whisper filled the air. "Daddy, come find me," the voice crooned, mockingly sweet. Tom's flashlight flickered, the beam weakening. His breath came in shallow gasps as he pressed himself against the door, his mind racing. Suddenly, the sound of tiny footsteps echoed through the room, moving impossibly fast. Tom raised his flashlight just as a figure darted past him, small, pale, and not entirely human. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You are not Lily," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure giggled again, its voice merging with Lily's, and something far darker. "Come play with us, Daddy," it hissed before disappearing into the shadows. The flashlight sputtered out, plunging Tom into darkness. His trembling hands fumbled with the phone, but the screen remained stubbornly black. He could hear them now, footsteps, whispers, and faint laughter surrounding him. The air grew oppressive, pressing against his chest like a weight. Summoning every ounce of courage, Tom banged on the door. "Let me out," he shouted, his voice cracking. The laughter grew louder, more chaotic, as if the hospital itself were mocking him. And then, silence. The door creaked open and Tom stumbled out into the hallway. His flashlight blinked back to life, casting long, jittery shadows. He ran, not caring where he was going, just desperate to escape. But the hospital seemed to twist around him, its layout changing with every turn. The corridor stretched and spiraled, leading him deeper into its maw. A familiar giggle stopped him in his tracks. He turned, and there she was, Lily, standing at the end of the hallway, her back to him. "Lily," he cried, relief washing over him. He ran toward her, but as he got closer, she turned. Her face was wrong. Her features were Lily's, but distorted, her eyes too wide. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You found me, Daddy?" she said, her voice a hollow echo. Tom stumbled backward, his heart pounding. "You are not my daughter," he whispered. She tilted her head, her grin widening. "Maybe not, but she's here somewhere. Want to play another game?" The lights flickered violently, and the walls seemed to close in. Tom turned and ran, the sound of Lily's distorted laughter chasing him. Doors slammed shut around him, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. Finally, he burst through the entrance, gasping for air. The cool night enveloped him, and he collapsed onto the pavement. He turned back to the hospital, its dark windows staring down at him like empty eyes. The door swung shut with a resounding clang, and the whispers ceased. "Lily!" he called, his voice hoarse, but the only response was the rustling of the wind. Tom sat there, trembling, until the first light of dawn painted the horizon. When the police arrived, they found him still sitting on the curb, staring at the hospital. They searched the building from top to bottom, but found no trace of Lily or anything else. Tom never stopped searching for his daughter, but he never returned to St. Mercy's. Some nights, though, as he lay awake, he swore he could hear her laughter, faint and distorted, carried on the wind. Ethan's rusted pickup truck groaned as he pulled off the narrow, forgotten road. The GPS had given up hours ago, and his cell service was non-existent. He was lost in the middle of nowhere, but the faint silhouette of a building in the distance caught his attention. Its dark, looming shape called to him, a strange mixture of dread and curiosity washing over him. As he parked on the edge of the overgrown lot, the structure was an abandoned hospital, its windows shattered, the walls streaked with years of decay. A crooked sign hung precariously above the entrance, St. Dymphna's Memorial Hospital. Ethan felt an odd chill as he approached, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense fog that had settled in with the twilight. Pushing open the front door, he was met with a screeching groan that echoed through the empty halls. The air was damp, and the faint scent of mildew mixed with something metallic and sour. He tried to convince himself it was just the stale air of an old building, but the back of his neck prickled, as if he were being watched. The lobby was cluttered with overturned chairs and broken glass. A faint scuffling noise made him whip around, his flashlight revealing nothing but shadows. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. No answer. Ethan pressed on, venturing deeper into the hospital. The halls stretched endlessly, walls peeling and stained with ominous brown streaks. Old medical charts littered the floor, their ink smudged and faded. He passed a wheelchair, its wheels rusted and motionless, but as he moved forward, he could have sworn he heard it creak behind him. When he turned around, the wheelchair was in a different spot. Heart pounding, Ethan chalked it up to his imagination. He took a deep breath and muttered, "Get a grip." But the deeper he ventured, the stranger things became. The faint murmur of voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a low, unintelligible whispering that sent shivers racing up his spine. It grew louder the closer he got to what looked like the operating rooms. The door to operating room 3 was ajar, its hinges barely clinging to the frame. Against his better judgment, Ethan nudged it open. Inside, the room was a tableau of frozen chaos. An operating table sat in the center, straps hanging limply from its sides. Instruments were scattered across the floor, and a dark stain spread beneath the table. Then he heard it, a faint, raspy breath that wasn't his own. Ethan spun around, his flashlight sweeping the room. Empty. The breath came again, this time behind him. He turned, and for a split second, he saw a shadow tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs, vanish into the wall. He stumbled backward, heart racing. "This isn't real," he whispered, gripping the flashlight as though it were his lifeline. But as he backed out of the room, something cold and clammy brushed against his arm. He bolted. The whispers turned into guttural moans, echoing through the halls as if the hospital itself were alive. Lights flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Ethan skidded to a stop in front of the elevator bank. The doors were pried open, revealing a dark, bottomless shaft. Suddenly, the old speaker system crackled to life, a distorted voice repeating, "Code Blue, Code Blue, Operating Room 3." The same room he had just fled from. The temperature plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs as he tried to find an exit. But every corridor seemed to loop back on itself, and doors that should have led outside only opened into more hallways. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. In one hallway, he saw a figure standing at the far end. It was the same shadowy entity from before, only now it had formed its hollow eyes staring at him, a grotesque smile splitting its pale face. Ethan turned and ran, but the sound of bare feet slapping against the tile floor told him it was following. He burst into what looked like the pediatric ward. Tiny beds were lined up against the walls, some with tattered sheets still draped over them. A child's laughter echoed through the room, high-pitched and unnatural. He turned to see a small figure sitting on one of the beds. It was a girl, her head tilted at an impossible angle, her eyes black pits. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a piercing scream erupted, shattering the fluorescent lights above. Ethan ran blindly, his flashlight now flickering. He found himself in the morgue, the metallic drawers lining the walls. One of the drawers slid open on its own, the sound grating and slow. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached out, followed by another. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and frenzied. Ethan stumbled backward, tripping over a loose tile. As he scrambled to his feet, the morgue drawers began slamming open and shut, each one releasing more shadowy figures. Desperate, he fled to the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. The whispers followed, now punctuated by guttural growls and faint sobbing. When he reached the roof, he thought he was safe. But the roof was no sanctuary. The shadowy figure was waiting for him, joined by dozens of others. They formed a circle around him, their hollow eyes and twisted faces illuminated by the blood-red moon hanging low in the sky. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of rage and despair. Ethan's flashlight finally died, plunging him into darkness. The last thing he saw was the tall figure reaching for him, its grotesque smile the only thing visible as the whispers coalesced. into a single, chilling phrase. Stay with us. The next morning, Ethan's truck was found abandoned on the edge of the lot. No one ever saw him again. But locals say that on quiet nights, if you stand near St. Dimpness, you can still hear the whispers and the sound of someone running, forever trying to escape.